Honourable Member for Edmonton St. Albert.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. It is a pleasure to rise and speak to third reading on Bill S4, which amends the Criminal Code to address the growing problem of identity theft. Madam Speaker, S4 has been reported back from the Standing Committee on Justice and Human Rights without amendment. As the witnesses who testified before the committee agreed, this legislation is urgently needed. The new and constantly evolving technologies which dramatically improve our lives are being exploited by enterprising criminals. Madam Speaker, identity theft is growing both in the number of incidents and in the amount of losses to consumers, to retailers, to service providers, to financial institutions, and also to governments. But as the witnesses and experts also made very clear, Madam Speaker, identity theft is not just about money. There is a great deal of fear among Canadians that their identities are being exploited and are being abused by criminals. When identity information is used in the course of a fraud, a travel-related offense or another offense, the ramifications on the victim can be severe. Victims of identity theft suffer psychological harm and feelings of being violated. In extreme cases, Madam Speaker, Canadians can lose their life savings and sometimes even their homes, or they could be left with a poor credit rating based on the criminal acts of others. Long after these victims spend their time and energy clearing their good names, there remain lingering feelings of vulnerability and the loss of control over their lives and anxiety for years to come over whether the nightmare is even ever over. The fear of whether their identities will be misused again at some unknown point in time in the future is always a constant for these victims, Madam Speaker. Police are increasingly seeking links between identity theft and organized crime and even terrorism. Organized criminals use other people's identities to camouflage their own identities and to commit crimes to generate large profits. We are seeing identity information collected in one place and shipped to criminal gangs in other countries instantaneously over the internet for manipulation. Madam Speaker, the criminals are getting ahead of us in their level of organization and sophistication. RCMP witnesses who testified before the Standing Committee on Justice and Human Rights explained that the key components of Bill S4 are new offenses that close legislative gaps. Right now, criminals can collect, possess, and traffic in identity information for criminal purposes, but they may not be guilty of any crime. While the ultimate criminal or fraudulent use of other people's identities is clearly criminal under a variety of offenses such as fraud or personation, Bill S4 directly targets the early phases of identity theft operations, which today may fall through the legal cracks. The new offenses contained in Bill S4 will allow the police to take action and lay charges even before a fraud is committed or a person is impersonated or someone unlawfully crosses the border with phony documents. As the RCMP witnesses testified before committee, Bill S4 will bring our laws one step closer to protecting not only individual Canadians, but also the integrity of the Canadian economy. Other aspects, Madam Speaker, of Bill S4 clarify and complement existing offences in the Criminal Code. For instance, in addition to existing offences that protect the Mail and Canada Post operations, new offences will be added for redirecting mail and stealing mail from a mailbox, both of which are known techniques used by identity thieves to gather information. As I already mentioned, Madam Speaker, new offences for collecting and possessing identity information are included in this bill, as is the new offence of trafficking in identity information. The offence of personation already prohibits the fraudulent use of another person's identity, and this now will be renamed, quote, identity fraud, unquote. The idea here, Madam Speaker, is for the criminal law to clearly express the full sequence of identity crime activities. Identity theft, the collecting and possessing of identity information, is followed by trafficking in identity information, which is then followed by identity fraud, the actual fraudulent use of the identity information. Bill S4 also extends the restitution provisions in the Criminal Code to help victims recover some of the costs they must bear to obtain new documents and otherwise rehabilitate their identities if they are victimized. This measure will hopefully go some way towards remedying the damage done to Canadians who struggle to cope with having lost control of their identities. Madam Speaker, Other vital aspects of Bill S4 are the narrowly tailored exemptions relating to the manufacture and use of false documents for use by undercover police officers. One exemption permits people who make false documents to be shielded from liability if they do so in good faith and at the request of a police agency or government department. The other exemption permits peace officers to make and use false identity documents without criminal liability solely where they do so for the purpose of maintaining a covert identity. Madam Speaker, in this House and in the committee and in the Senate, some concerns were raised about the exemptions because they do not contain an oversight or accountability mechanism. The government considers it entirely appropriate to grant these exemptions as the making and use of false documents for covert investigations is fundamental to effective law enforcement. The exemptions are very narrow. They do not permit anyone to commit fraud or identity theft or impersonation or any offense outside of a few narrow forgery offenses. Peace officers can use the false documents only for the purpose of maintaining their covert identity. They will fall outside the scope of the exemption if they use the forged documents for any other purpose, Madam Speaker. The government considers these exemptions to be close parallels to the exemption provided to police for the carrying of a firearm. There is no oversight required for each occasion on which a police officer carries his or her weapon. The law simply makes it clear that he may carry a firearm whenever he is on the job. Similarly, requiring oversight for each instance in which an undercover agent makes or uses a false identity document to support his or her covert identity would be administratively burdensome, if not impossible. More importantly, as there is no conceivable harm that can come to Canadians by these limited exemptions, oversight would serve no conceivable useful purpose. The government is confident, Madam Speaker, that the exemptions in Bill S4 are both necessary and appropriate. It bears mentioning that in the Senate, the Legal and Constitutional Affairs Committee amended this bill to put in a 5-year review of the legislation. The government is pleased that the legislation will be reviewed so that parliamentarians can consider how effective the law has been at helping to reduce and prevent identity fraud.